Today we will rank China's most important allies. China is a formidable global power with the world's second largest economy and a GDP exceeding $18 trillion. It's also the top trading partner for 120 other countries. Yet, it's kind of hard to be friends with China. While their influence expands across continents, they only have one formal defense treaty with another country. In this video, we'll be looking at political, economic, and military ties between China and its allies and rank them based upon their strategic importance and how they fit into China's vision of the future. Up first is Saudi Arabia, and they perfectly represent the complexity of getting into bed with and partnering with China. The Chinese buy a ton of Saudi oil, and as one of their primary suppliers, the Saudis are very beholden to Chinese demands. So when they say they want to trade in yuan as opposed to US dollars, the Saudis acquiesce. The issue is, while China wants the yuan to be more of a global currency used in all sorts of global trade, very few people want to trade between each other using yuan. And so by the Saudis not using the yuan in any other forms of global trade with all their other partners, they're not a hyper-aligned ally. Similarly, they can provide very little support in any sort of security concern that China is dealing with. They basically load up the tanker, that tanker sets off for the Chinese mainland, and it's out of the Saudi control. Yes, they've set up a pipeline going through Pakistan that can serve as another route, but that's just another means for them to get paid. And at the same time, China can't project a ton of power into the Middle East. And another one of their allies that we're going to talk about later, Iran, is on the exact opposite side of all of the Saudi security concerns. So for that reason, we're going to put Saudi in the A tier, not the S tier, the A tier, despite them being one of China's most important suppliers. Next up is Japan. And you might even say to yourself, how is it possible that Japan would even be included as an ally for China? Well, then you'd have to ask the Chinese embassy that, because it is listed as one of the 28 countries that China considers a partner in some way, shape, or form in their formalized statement of international relations. And that's because, like many other countries, Japan's number one trading partner is China. But outside of the economics, all of their collaboration completely falls apart. Japan is probably the most stressed out by the increasing aggression that China has shown in the East China Sea, and is actually taking steps to modernize its military, its navy, and build out its military bases in response to the risk of Chinese aggression. And when the Japanese public is polled, 85% of the population holds a largely negative view towards China. So their politicians are boxed in even if they wanted to deepen ties. And if we look back in history, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is the creator of the Indo-Pacific framework that ultimately was a security and defensive response to the growing economic power of China. So the reason they feel as boxed in as they do right now is largely because of Abe's efforts. For that reason, E tier for Japan. Next up is Indonesia, and we're going to place them in the C tier because we've made an entire video about Indonesia that really breaks down how they play off both the US and China to advance their own interests. The short of it is they're far enough away from China to not be too influenced, but have used Belt and Road money to build out necessary infrastructure for them to turn their economy around. Next up is the Philippines. Kind of like Japan, it's like, how would we even potentially consider them an ally? But once again, they're listed on the Chinese embassy as one of their 28 countries that they have partnerships with. It is an enormous trading partner for the Philippines, $41 billion of trade last year, and yet they have multiple disputes in the South China Sea over sovereignty of shoals and maritime waters that both countries claim. Most recently, that came to a head over the Second Thomas Shoal and the Sierra Madre ship that was grounded there. But in general, if you're blasting the other country's people with water cannons and hitting them with hammers and in general escalating to aggression, not a great ally. And unfortunately, that's going to apply to some other countries that we're listing later in this video. E tier for the Philippines. Now, if you live in China, you have no choice when it comes to surveillance. The authoritarian one-party state is always watching you. We can't change how things are in China, but we can change the way that we're surveilled here in the West. You've probably noticed that just by doing basic stuff like shopping online or filling out paperwork, your data gets collected. Marketers put it on lists and sell it to corporations who flood your inbox and your phone with spam. And until recently, I didn't think that there was a way out. Then I found Incogni. You and I actually have legal protections against the predatory way in which our data is bought and sold. The problem is it's complicated and takes a lot of time to actually get your name off these lists. With Incogni, they'll do it for you. Once you sign up, they'll show you a dashboard with all of the marketing lists that they're working on taking your name off of. So you get to see your name being taken off lists that you didn't even know you were on. I'm signed up for the yearly plan, which means Incogni is constantly monitoring month after month to keep me off of these lists. And I'm already seeing results. Get your information off the databases with the link in my description. Use the code Watson at the link below to get an exclusive 60% off an annual plan with Incogni. Or go to incogni.com/Watson. Clicking that link helps support the channel, but it also gets you access to an amazing service. And the best part is it's risk-free. You can try Incogni for 30 days, and if you decide it's not useful for you, you can get your money back. 30 days, risk-free. Go sign up, and thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to our tier list. Next up is South Korea, and they're also going on the E tier with the Philippines and Japan. And while both South Korea and Japan have signed on to the CHIPS Act, which is an embargo that was initiated by the United States, also joined in by the Netherlands, intended at holding back the Chinese semiconductor industry, South Korea has been far less stringent with its enforcement of the CHIPS Act in comparison to Japan. South Korea has kind of been slow rolling it because, like all these other countries, China is their biggest trade partner. Samsung, which is the primary semiconductor company in South Korea, is highly dependent on access to the Chinese market, and that is a systemically important company for them. Samsung makes up 22% of South Korea's entire GDP. That's the highest percentage of any major developed country out there. And so while they would love to be highly aligned with their Western alliances, they have to kind of keep their feet in both ends of the pool in order to keep their economy afloat. However, their bright red line is the country to their immediate northern border, North Korea. North Korea is one of the 7 countries with nuclear weapon capabilities and the only country with which China has a mutual aid and cooperation treaty. That was signed back in 1961. And it's worth asking why. If a country has no other mutual defense treaties besides this one, why is that occurring when, by all accounts, North Korea does some pretty deplorable things to its citizens and is a real security risk to basically all of its neighbors? And that is because North Korea is the most important buffer state on China's entire border. One of the hardest things to appreciate or really conceptualize for folks in most other countries is how many countries China shares a border with. I'm not going to try to name them all off the top of my head, but it's over a dozen. But in the case of North Korea, right across the border from North Korea is the heart of China. It's Beijing, it's northern China, it's an enormous amount of their resources. If North Korea were to be occupied by an enemy, that would be an even graver security risk than how Russia perceives Ukraine. It would be even more existential for them. So for that reason, they are arm in arm, absolutely completely lined up with North Korea. And North Korea provides military cooperation and also the most reliable anti-United States stance of any country that we'll be covering in today's video. So for that reason, North Korea is going on the S tier. As we cycle down to Southeast Asia, we go to Laos, which is going on the A tier for a similar reason North Korea. They are an important buffer state, this time between China and Vietnam. However, the risk of Vietnam and the geographical significance is not quite as great, and Laos is simply not as formidable a foe as North Korea would be in the case of a military intervention. However, these countries just celebrated a 15-year anniversary of their comprehensive strategic partnership. There's a ton of Belt and Road Initiative investment going into Laos, and so for that reason, they sit at the bottom of the A tier. Up next is Vietnam, and Vietnam might be the murkiest picture of any of the countries that we're going to break down in this video because they do accept Belt and Road money. They are major trading partners. It is a location where you see Chinese investment into Vietnamese manufacturing. as the cost of living in China has gone up and they've kind of been outcompeted as the lowest cost of labor place in Southeast Asia to do manufacturing. And similarly, one of the ways that China has kind of skirted tariffs and avoided other sanctions is by exporting stuff into Vietnam then exporting stuff that was actually made in China and avoiding tariffs in that way. I believe that's been done in steel and a couple other industries. Yet, at the same time, China has made some of the most aggressive claims to Vietnamese territory in their aggressive posture in the South China Sea. And in the myopic US-centric view that I, as an American, tend to have, you lose sight of the idea that, wow, Vietnam will never side with us in matters in Asia because we had the Vietnam War with them. Well, more recently than that, after the Vietnam War concluded, there was the Sino-Vietnam War, which was about a border dispute between communist China and communist Vietnam. And so, when you think about those histories that most Americans, most of the West are blind to or of memory hold, you have to remember that all these countries are long-standing and they do not forget a war that happened less than 50 years ago. We're putting Vietnam on the C tier. Up next is Cambodia. Cambodia is probably the most pro-China of any of the Southeast Asian countries. They get a ton of Chinese tourism and China kind of pushes them in that direction as a reward for Cambodia's loyalty. And also they collaborate militarily. So Cambodia's refurbishment of the Ream Naval Base has shared access with Chinese security and military forces. So Cambodia's at the bottom of the A tier. Up next is Thailand. Thailand is going in the C tier for basically the same reason as Indonesia. They are a little bit further away from China. They have a little bit more autonomy, therefore. And very similarly, they play that game of US versus China. They'll kind of extract a little bit of concessions from both, whoever's, kind of got the biggest carrot more so than the scariest stick to advance their economic needs and gains. So while they have taken Belt and Road money and they have economic ties, there's not a lot more there besides that. Up next is Myanmar, and Myanmar is interesting because their Belt and Road initiatives are some of the most focused at relieving a Chinese strategic choke point. In other YouTube videos, military analysis, people talk about the Strait of Malacca and how all of the energy imports that China takes in come through that strait, and how there are multiple entities that could basically choke that off and cause irreparable damage to the Chinese economy. Investments into Myanmar have been focused on trying to divert resources or create an alternative pathway for resources to still make its way into China and not be so reliant upon that narrow strait of tankers moving through. And the development of Myanmar's ports have also played a big role in that. However, this is not a particularly stable country. They did have a military coup in 2021. And so that is a kind of a source of unreliability despite their strategic alignment. So we're going to put them at the A tier, but you could very easily see that drop to B or C tier if things get really unstable in Myanmar. Up next is the Maldives. And this is not a big country, but it is highly strategically important. They have long-standing economic ties with China through the Belt and Road Initiative, have received substantial investments, and the Maldives' foreign policy has kind of evolved in the direction of China, and the Maldives serve as an important midpoint in the Indian Ocean. So the Maldives are on the C tier. Which brings us to India. India is in BRICS with China, along with Brazil and Russia and South Africa. And so people see that, and you see these headlines come out that they're going to create this alternative to the US dollar, and it's going to unseat dollar hegemony. And yet, year after year, a little proclamation is made, a little hubbub is spun up, and nothing actually comes of that. And a lot of its members can't even really get along with each other outside of some economic ties. As recently as 2020, there was a violent clash between India and China in Galwan Valley over a border dispute. Very rarely do people become really scary allies with one another while simultaneously navigating a violent border dispute, right? In fact, it was that dispute that has led to India starting to ramp its military budget. And I promise you, they're not doing it so that they can go arm in arm with China in some sort of World War III scenario. I see India as one of the most effective entities at playing all sides of international conflict. They were still importing Russian oil well after they invaded Ukraine. They are in different cooperative groups with China, yet are receiving enormous foreign investment from the United States and from the West. They are simply playing all sides, and that makes them a very unreliable, unattached player. And so I'm putting them at the top of the E tier for this video. Bangladesh is going in the B tier. Really, they're just kind of useful as a market that China can engage with, and potentially as a buffer or a containment country for India's growth as an economy. The fact that Bangladesh's strategic significance is in relation to India tells you everything you need to know about India as an ally. And another reason that India isn't particularly thrilled with China is that they give a ton of money to Pakistan. They share military technology. They sell a bunch of military equipment to Pakistan. And India and Pakistan have gone to war 4 times in the last century. So Pakistan is India's largest security concern. Pakistan is a nuclear power, and Pakistan is also another one of the economic corridors that China is trying to develop as a way to relieve the stress of the Malacca Strait and those other choke points out on the open ocean that they are unable to resolve. And so while Pakistan goes on the S tier, you can kind of see it's going to be really difficult for India and China to ever become tightly intertwined and work together at a high level, particularly as long as Pakistan is one of China's biggest allies. Sri Lanka represents another part of the Belt and Road Initiative and how China is trying to secure its access to Middle Eastern energy resources. They put a ton of money into Sri Lanka's ports. That can serve as a way station as tankers and other vessels are moving towards East Asia. But outside of that, Sri Lanka does not offer much in the way of strategic significance, so we're putting them at the bottom of the B tier. Up next is Iran. And Iran is one of China's most important allies for a couple of straightforward reasons. Number one, they produce a ton of energy. Number two, they are firmly in the anti-US stance, so similar to North Korea. It would take a major reversal for their position against the US to change. And so for that reason, they've been heavily sanctioned and are therefore highly reliant upon China for key supplies, materials as a trading partner. And that gives China an enormous amount of leverage in those discussions. It allows them to share intelligence. And quite frankly, as Iran is increasingly aggressive in the Middle East against Israel through other proxies with other countries, it does draw some of the attention away from what China is doing in the South China Sea, in East Asia, and the ability to create a lack of strategic focus by China's primary competitor or adversary, however you want to frame it, is of enormous strategic benefit. So S tier for Iran. Now we're headed north of China, first to Mongolia. Mongolia is completely landlocked, completely dependent upon China. Like many countries, it's their largest trading partner. And they're doing a ton of Belt and Road investment there, but there just isn't that much kind of economic gain to be had by this basically subservient junior relationship that Mongolia has with China. So we'll put them on the B tier because they're pretty much a lapdog and they'll do whatever China needs. They just can't really do that much. Russia, on the other hand, is increasingly in a similar position. They are so locked down by Western sanctions and constrained diplomatically because of the war in Ukraine that they have very few partners. They have very few people that are aligned with them in an anti-Western stance. And because of that, they are highly dependent on China, not only for supplies to feed the war machine and to build up the Russian industrial base, but also as a place to export their natural gas and oil. So as part of the trading that has happened, particularly since the Ukraine war, we've seen Russia give up some of its military technology, like plans for nuclear submarines, to China in exchange for the economic support that they desperately need in order to continue to prosecute their war. Russia probably sits at the very top of the S tier for China's allies. And, the idea that they're doing joint military activities and naval exercises together does not help me sleep well at night. That is probably the greatest risk to the Western world out there. And I think that the savviest or the most adroit political leaders would find some way to weaken that relationship. That relationship is tightening and improving as the recent years have gone by, and I would love to see this partnership weakened in the decade ahead. Now we're going to run through Central Asia really quickly. Tajikistan is at the low end of the B tier. They do host a Chinese military base, and China does a ton of foreign investment into Tajikistan, allows them to build power plants and power grids and railways and highways, but not dissimilar from Mongolia. They just don't bring a ton to the table necessarily. Kyrgyzstan brings even less. They are highly reliant on China as an economic partner. 44% of Kyrgyzstani imports come from China, and they're also heavily indebted. So as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, they issue these loans so that important infrastructure can be built in these countries, and Kyrgyzstan just doesn't have the economy to actually pay that back.
C tier for Kyrgyzstan.
Next is Kazakhstan. That is the largest economy of Central Asia, and they also have enormous uranium supplies. So as China is searching for ways to become more energy independent, one of the strategies is to build nuclear plants. They're also building coal plants and other things, but it will be from Kazakhstan that they get a bunch of their uranium. And they also create strategic depth between China and Russia. So Central Asia is kind of like Russia's soft underbelly. People usually think of them as like a Western country in their Western front with the European countries. And that is a potential additional point of leverage that China could have on one of their allies.
Kazakhstan is going on the A tier. Very nice.
Turkmenistan is going at the top of the B tier, really just because they are the largest natural gas supplier to China from Central Asia. So that's really important, but they're not bringing much to the table besides that. Very last is Afghanistan. We're putting them on the D tier just because of the political instability that was left in the wake of the US retreating out of Afghanistan and the kind of aftermath of the horrific century that the Afghanis have had to go through. There is the potential that if you could control and organize and deploy Afghanistan focus and resources to the betterment of China, that they could climb somewhere similar to Pakistan in strategic significance. But when people kind of point to that as a place that the US withdrew from, it's like, well, now China can step in. It's like, have fun, man. That's a place that wrecked the Soviet Union. It's a place that in many ways wrecked the United States. There's not a lot for you there in terms of establishing some sort of stronghold and major economic or military advantage. And that is our around the world of major Chinese allies. I'm sure I missed a few. You can roast me in the comments for forgetting to mention Timor-Leste or some other small insignificant country. But thank you for watching. Hit subscribe and check out our other videos on the channel.